Fellas, there are many indicators of a fighter being good in the UFC without actually having to watch their fights themselves. This could just be the location that they come from, the team that they have around them, but we're going to be taking a look at a few indicators of a fighter being good and kind of ranking them and talking about how good of an indicator is it that this fighter is actually good and how much potential they have in the UFC. And we'll just go straight in there with the first indicator of a fighter being good, which is being undefeated. Now, we're going to split this up into two categories, why it's useful and why it's completely useless. So is this a useless thing? Does it have any indication at all, or is it quite useful? And is it a good indicator of a fighter being good? Now, if we go on the first example of why it's useful, looking at undefeated fighters, it shows that nobody's been able to stop them. I mean, no shit. But yeah, if a fighter's undefeated, all of their opponents previously have failed at doing the one job of beating them. What makes you think you're better than all the other opponents, and what makes you think you're above them and going to be able to figure this opponent out? It shows that many people have tried, many have failed. So I think being undefeated shows that, again, no one's been able to stop them before, and they've kind of just been on this complete streak. Again, it depends how big of a record of undefeated they have. If they're like 5-0, they're nothing really special. But if they're like 20 or 25-0, now you're talking about a fighter potentially being special. So I think it shows that no one's been able to stop them. The second reason why it's useful is it shows that they're clearly capable. If they're undefeated, even if they're beating bums, they're clearly capable of doing something, especially if they're in the UFC and they've made it to the big league. If they're an undefeated fighter in the UFC and they've got a decent record going, it shows that they're able to beat at least low-level opponents and kind of local opponents to make it to the UFC. So they're clearly capable of beating people who obviously aren't capable. And then the third reason is they are just going to be difficult to beat. If no one's been able to do it before, it is going to be difficult to beat these undefeated fighters in the UFC. Because no one has been able to do it before. Many people of many different styles have tried before and many have failed. So it looks like from the record alone, it is going to be difficult to beat these fighters. But why it's kind of useless to use, being undefeated as an indication of how good a fight is, it doesn't show the quality of opponents. And in my opinion, I value quality of opponents over quantity of opponents. You could be undefeated after beating complete bums, and it doesn't really look that special in hindsight. But I would favour a guy who has kind of won a few fights, lost a few fights, but he's lost against top-level opponents and beaten some decent level opposition as well, rather than a guy that's just beaten complete bums and never lost before. So in my opinion, I think the quality of opponents matter more than the quantity of opponents, who you've lost and who you've beaten to, over just a number on a record. I also think lots of fighters tend to be undefeated these days. It seems like in every UFC weight class there's like 5 to 10 undefeated fighters. I mean, how many ranked fighters these days are undefeated? A couple of years ago, being undefeated was a big deal because there was very rarely any fighters that were undefeated. But nowadays, it's not that hard to find an undefeated fighter. I mean, nearly every single card in the UFC has 1 or 2 undefeated fighters on there somewhere. So a lot of them tend to be undefeated these days, so it's not really that special. And the third reason is being undefeated doesn't equal good. It's all good being undefeated and being able to beat this low-level opposition, but the second you face somebody who's actually good, you're going to lose that. And you've got to remember that everyone in MMA, no matter who they are, starts off undefeated until they're obviously no longer undefeated. So an undefeated fighter, for the most part, is only just waiting to lose, unless you're like Khabib, who retires undefeated. So those are some examples of why it's useful and useless. Now, if we look at some examples of a fighter that's undefeated and have gone on to do great things, I mean, Khabib Nurmagomedov, like I said, one of the greatest lightweights of all time, and that's kind of why people hyping up, because he retired undefeated. The current featherweight champion, Ilia Topuria, and one of the best in the world right now, and like I said, he's undefeated as well. Shavkat Rakhmonov, not only is he undefeated, but he's finished every single fighter that he's faced. So these are 3 examples of fighters who are undefeated, but have also made it far in the UFC. But there's also been fighters who have been undefeated and haven't looked good in the UFC. Bryce Mitchell was once an undefeated prospect. Now he can't even make it into the top 10. Bo Nickel, he's undefeated, but he's still got miles to go. Darren Till was once undefeated, and now what? He's lost like 5 out of his last 6. He's not even in the UFC anymore. So being undefeated is not a congruent example of skill. Therefore, I don't think it's the most reliable source of showing how good a fighter is. The next thing we've got, the next indicator, is coming from a different combat sports background at the highest level. Now, why this is useful is because it shows that you're clearly elite in a specific martial art. You're not just a guy who's had some decent MMA career before the UFC. It shows that you're at least elite in a certain martial art, whether that be kickboxing, boxing, wrestling. And being elite in a martial art can definitely help you in your early UFC career. So I think it can definitely show that you've got the talent early on. And it also shows that an ability to compete at the highest level. It shows that you're able to compete in high-level situations and in whatever sport you're in. It shows that the competition doesn't get to you. It shows that you can definitely show those competition in the UFC, show that competition in the UFC with your specific martial art. So I think showing that ability to compete at the highest level in a different martial art is a good indicator, rather than just fighting on the local scene in a different MMA promotion. And it also shows that you might be one-dimensional, but you are dangerous. And if you are matched up against the right opponent, you could display some great talent in the UFC. Like if you're a really, really good kickboxer outside of the UFC and you get matched up against the right guy, it could make you display display your skills really good in the UFC, and you can blow through your first couple of opponents if you're in the right matches. So I think it's a good indicator of how good a fighter is, but some reasons why it's useless is because going off that one-dimensional thing, you could be shit at other martial arts, and that could just completely make you look terrible. Like, you could be the greatest kickboxer of all time, and if you get put against a semi-decent wrestler, you're going to look like an absolute amateur in MMA. You're going to look like you're not even UFC worthy, despite having this big kickboxing background behind of you. So I think, you know, being shit in other martial arts doesn't really make up for being a good kickboxer or whatever you are, because at the end of the day, it's mixed martial arts. You know, it's every martial art combined, not just whatever you do. And skills may not transition to MMA. Like I said, this is mixed martial arts. It's all good being a high-level wrestler, but what about when you eat a knee to the face? It's all good being a really good kickboxer, but how do you do when you're on your back? This is MMA. This isn't whatever combat sports you're doing. It's not about getting in favourable matchups in MMA, and you've got to be an elite MMA fighter to be an elite MMA fighter. So the skills may not transition to MMA. And the third reason, being elite in one sport doesn't mean, like I said, you're going to be elite in MMA. You could be the greatest kickboxer of all time, one of the most ferocious kickers, and then get out-wrestled by a semi-decent grappler in the UFC. So I don't think these are example. I don't think it's necessarily a big indicator of how good a fighter is. It shows that they're able to compete at the highest level, and it shows that they're obviously good at whatever martial art they're competing in, but I don't think it's an indicator of how far they can go in the UFC. If we look at some examples of fighters that have come from a big combat sports background that haven't necessarily succeeded in the UFC, have succeeded. Alex Pereira came from Glory Kickboxing. Now he's one of the greatest of all time. Held belts in 2 weight classes, and is the light heavyweight champion of the world. Daniel Cormier had a wrestling background, and now again one of the greatest of all time. Israel Adesanya came from kickboxing as well, and now he's the 2nd greatest middleweight of all time. So these are some examples of fighters that have come from a different sport and have made it really successful in the UFC. But there's also been fighters on the other end of the spectrum. You know, Dustin Jacoby also came from kickboxing. Now he can't even crack the rankings of the light heavyweight division. Blood Diamond, this dude, this kickboxer with a ton of hype, coming over to the UFC, and he looked absolutely terrible in the UFC. Cesar Almeida, this kickboxer, hyped up as being the guy that beat Alex Pereira, and he ends up getting out wrestled by Roman Kopylov. So I think coming from a different combat sports background isn't the most reliable indicator. Then we've got being from Dagestan. Being from Dagestan can be a massive indicator of how good a fighter is nowadays. Most people kind of just look at if a fighter's from Dagestan or not and base their entire prediction off that. Why it's useful is because Dagestan is known for producing monsters. It's no surprise that a lot of the monsters coming on the UFC these past couple of years do tend to be from Dagestan, and they do produce monsters. In fact, I would say they produce more monsters per amount of fighters than any other country. I know America's probably got more fighters than Dagestan, but if you look at the size of Dagestan and the amount of killers they're producing, it shows that they're obviously a very reliable indicator. They are also known for being unstoppable wrestlers. I know Dagestanis nowadays tend to be a lot more well-rounded, but they are known for being unstoppable wrestlers that just go round after round, and being a Dagestani wrestler is completely different to being an American wrestler. These Dagestani wrestlers seem to be unstoppable. No one can really seem to stop this new wave of Dagestan wrestling that seems to be taking over the UFC. So they are known for being unstoppable wrestlers, and they seem to be the most difficult type of fighter to beat. A lot of these Dagestani fighters tend to be undefeated, and if they're not undefeated, they're still high-level opponents. They seem to be able to run through everyone of completely different styles and, you know, just however good skill their opponents are. So those are some good indicators and useful indicators of how good Dagestani fighters can be. But why it's useless is because, in my opinion, it depends on the individual. Not all Dagestanis are unstoppable. There has been some Dagestanis in the UFC that haven't been able to make it into the rankings, that haven't been able to display their talent at the highest level, that haven't been able to even make it to the UFC. So I think it really does just depend on the individual rather than just simply being from Dagestan. And there has been Dagestani fighters that have looked absolutely terrible. Only the good Dagestani fighters get recognised. Why would there be a lot of attention on the Dagestanis that haven't made it far in the UFC, that haven't done well? Why would there be any attention on those guys? All the attention is obviously only on the ones who have actually made it successful. So there have been Dagestanis that haven't got going. No one has just recognised them. And they usually do lack striking. Like I said, I know there's a lot of more well-rounded Dagestanis these days, but for the majority of the Dagestanis, they tend to be really good wrestlers with mediocre striking. So it shows that they're not just complete monsters and, you know, these well-rounded machines that are unstoppable in every facet of every, you know, area of MMA. So those are some reasons why it's useful and useless. Now, if we look at some examples of fighters from Dagestan that have done well, obviously, like I said before, Khabib Nurmagomedov, one of the greatest of all time, one of the greatest lightweights of all time. Islam Makhachev, again, probably the greatest lightweight of all time, pound for pound #1 right now in the UFC. Umar Nurmagomedov, an undefeated contender in the bantamweight division, who's probably going to be the champion in a year from now. So these are some examples of fighters that have come from Dagestan that have made it really far in the UFC and have looked unstoppable. Now, there have been fighters from Dagestan that haven't looked as good. Muslim Salikov, I know he's like 40 years old and whatever. but he hasn't been able to crack the welterweight rankings. Saidna Magomedov, he's lost 3 times. He struggled to make the bantamweight rankings as well. Tagirul Bekov, he's been beaten before in the flyweight division a few times as well. He can't really seem to be a top contender in the flyweight division, so it's not like the second that these fighters from Dagestan make it to the UFC, they're just going to immediately become a top contender. Bekov as well even trains with Khabib, and even he's not been able to make it to the top level, so I think it's a good indicator, and the Dagestani fighters do tend to be better than all the others, but it's not just a clear indicator of how good a fighter is. The next indicator is from a high-level camp. So, is it useful to be from a high-level camp? Well, one reason why it could be useful is because it shows that they've got a great team around them. It shows that they're training with some high-level opposition. They're training with the best facilities in the world, a team that has managed to produce killers in the past. So, I think training with a good team shows that, you know, obviously they are training with a good team. They're getting that correct preparation. It also shows that they're getting access to the best sparring partners and facilities. The best way to improve as a fighter is to improve after sparring sessions. So, if you're getting sparring sessions and learning against the best fighters in the world, guys who are competing at the highest level, that's going to be the best source of sparring you can get, and therefore you're going to improve more than any other fighter in the world, or any other fighter that isn't sparring. So they're getting access to the best facilities, the best sparring partners, the best training preparation they need, and they are likely to improve a ton. If you're in a training camp that's one of the best in the world versus a training camp that's kind of shit, the likelihood is you are going to improve rapidly in that training camp. You could be a guy off the street. If you're in one of the best MMA gyms in the world, you're going to improve massively in that 1 year alone. So I think it is a good indicator. Reasons why it might be useless, though, is because the camp can't fight for you. You could have the greatest camp of all time in MMA history, but at the end of the day, none of those guys, none of those sparring partners, none of those coaches can fight for you. It's just you and your opponent, not the camp. Only what you've learned from that camp. The second reason is a good camp doesn't equal a good fighter. Like I said before, you could be in one of the best MMA gyms in the world with the correct preparation, but how good are your attributes? How good are you at learning? How quick do you learn? How well do you match up against your opponent's style? These are things that can't necessarily be changed within a training camp. So the good camp doesn't necessarily equal a good fighter, and it depends on how good the fighter is rather than the training camp. Again, in my opinion, I'd much rather see how good a fighter is rather than just what gym they come from. I think it depends on how good the fighter and what skills the fighter has shown rather than just where they train out of. So I'm more of a fan of the fighter than necessarily the camp themselves. But if we look at some fighters who have come from a high-level camp and has made it successful in the UFC, Tom Aspinall transitioned his training camp to a bunch of heavyweights, and now he's one of the best. No, now he is the best heavyweight in the world. Gene Silva and Caio Brallo come from Fighting Nerds, and nowadays, if you're a fighter from Fighting Nerds, the likelihood is the commentary aren't going to stop talking about Fighting Nerds because it is one of the best MMA gyms in the world right now, or at least from the fighters that they're producing. So I think coming from a high-level camp and certain camps can kind of be an indicator of how good you are, but there's also fighters that have come from a good camp and have done terrible. Blood Diamond, another example. I'm pretty sure he trained at City Kickboxing with guys like Adesanya, Dan Hooker, and Kai Kara France. He couldn't get going in the UFC. He looked pure shit. Chris Duncan, the dude's barely scraping UFC talent these days. He trains at American Top Team. Brad Riddell, he also trains at City Kickboxing. He can't even crack the rankings either these days. So I think it's a good indicator, but I think, again, it's more on the individual fighter rather than necessarily the training camp that they come from. Because I can guarantee that even the most high-level training camps in the UFC have had shit fighters before. So I guess you can take what you want from that. The next indicator is, are they labelled a prospect or do they have hype to their name? Now, the reasons why this is useful is because they've obviously looked impressive to gain that hype. Listen, they've not got this hype for no reason, whether it be flashy finishes, whether it be, you know, a massive streak that they've gone on, whether it be just whatever it may be that makes them look good. They've obviously done something to look impressive in their MMA career to gain that hype from the fans, which obviously shows an indicator that they are somewhat good at whatever they do. And the next reason is fans think fondly of them for a reason. Like I said before, fans aren't just going to be hyped over people for no reason. If there's a guy who's complete shit, the fans aren't going to be hyped of this guy. So there's obviously something that this fighter has, and whatever it may be, that makes the fans fond of these guys and makes the fans think that these guys have so much potential in their future. And the third reason is they are usually talented up-and-comers. If they are labelled as prospects and guys that have a lot of talent, the chances are they're better than a lot of the talent that we've seen. They show something really impressive. They show a lot of potential to be a big star in the UFC. And for that reason, obviously, it kind of shows that they have displayed talent before in their MMA career. So again, I think being labelled a prospect is a good kind of indicator of how good you are, but that also comes with its drawbacks. Why it's useless? Nobody's allergic to a fraud check. We've seen it time and time again. A big prospect who's going to be a future champion loses at the first hurdle. I mean, Adrian Yanez was this big bantamweight, big bantamweight prospect who ended up getting knocked out by Rob Font in his first big test. So nobody's allergic to a fraud check. Anybody can get fraud checked. Another reason is because hype is hype. It doesn't mean you're good. All hype is how much the fans recognize it, how much the fans are excited to see you. That's all hype is. None of that contributes or none of that changes into actual skill. You could be the most hyped fighter on the planet. It doesn't matter at all in the octagon, because when you're in there with an opponent, it comes down to your skill versus theirs, and absolutely none of that hype matters or contributes to your skill at all. So all hype is simply just hype. And the third reason is you may have looked good against low-level opponents. Nowadays, to be a good prospect in the UFC, you just have to look impressive against bums. Being a prospect these days isn't about beating a high-level opponent. It's just looking good on the regional scene, looking good against low-level opponents, and that doesn't necessarily transition to being a top-level fighter in the UFC. So if we look at some fighters who have been labelled a prospect and have gone on to do really good things in the UFC, Diego Lopez, he was once a prospect, now he's a big contender in the featherweight division, going to be fighting for a belt in his next fight. Sean O'Malley, he was once a hyped prospect and then went on to become the bantamweight defending champion of the world. Umar Nurmagomedov, a guy who everyone said was a prospect who hasn't beaten anybody good, and now he's going to be fighting for a belt in his next fight, just beat Sandhagen. So these are some examples of fighters that have been a prospect before and are now legit contenders or even former champions. Now, some prospects that haven't gone so well, like I said before, Adrian Yanez was once the big bantamweight prospect in a very similar position to Peyton Talbot. Then he gets knocked out by Rob Font and then finished by Jonathan Martinez. Rebellious Despain, this 6'9" Cuban heavyweight that's going to save the heavyweight division, ends up losing to Waldo Cortez Acosta at the first hurdle. Raul Rosas Jr. loses one of his first fights to Christian Rodriguez. So there have been prospects before that haven't made it far in the UFC simply due to just, being way too hyped for no reason. Now, if we look at another indicator, the opponent's win-loss percentage. So what is the win-loss percentage of the opponents that you have faced before? Why it's useful? It shows how impressive your wins actually are. Like I said, if you've beaten some opponents with a really, really good win-loss percentage record, it shows that you've beaten some good opponents, and therefore, you're not just a guy that's frauded himself to the UFC. You've beaten some good talent. You've beaten some guys that have looked good against other people, and therefore, it shows that you're quite an impressive guy in the UFC or MMA. The next useful factor is it shows the quality of the past opponents in comparison to you. So if you're an opponent and you're looking at your opponent's win-loss percentage, it shows how good the past opponents are. If they've got a really, really good win-loss percentage of their opponents, that it showed that they've been able to beat some good fighters previously. If not, it shows that they haven't really gone against any elite fighters as of yet. And the third reason is, are they a monster or are they a fraud? If you're a fighter who's got a really, really good win-loss percentage like Demetrius Johnson, or the opponents have got a really, really good win-loss percentage, it shows that, you're a good fighter. You've beaten some good opponents. You've not just got wins over cans. You've beaten some pretty good fighters. But you can also fraud yourself to the UFC. Again, we talk about record. You could have a really good record, but if your opponent's win-loss percentage is terrible, it says nothing about you as a fighter. So those are some reasons why it can be useful, but why it's useless is opponent quality doesn't exactly show how good you are. Like I said, just because your opponents have a good win-loss percentage, that doesn't necessarily transition to you being a good fighter. You being a good fighter just transitions to simply you being a good fighter, not necessarily the quality of your opponents. Even if you have beaten a couple of good fighters or your opponents have good win-loss records, what's to say that your opponents haven't beaten bums either? What's to say that your opponents are necessarily high level just because they've had good records? So I don't think it shows how good you are. Also, you could beat a bunch of bums, but it doesn't necessarily make you bad. If your opponents have a terrible record, or even, I'm going to go back to the example of Umar Nurmagomedov, who hadn't really beaten anyone good previous to his Sandhagen fight, that doesn't necessarily make you a bad fighter. That just means you haven't beaten anyone good yet. And he showed in that fight with Sandhagen, despite not beating anyone good previously, he was still one of the best bantamweights in the world. So I think those are the two reasons why it's useless. Now, we've looked at some examples of fighters with a really good win-loss percentage of opponents. I mean, some of the greatest of all time, Demetrius Johnson, John Jones, GSP, these guys are some of the greatest of all time, and their opponents really do have some really good win-loss percentages to their record. But there's also, on the other end of the spectrum, Khabib Nurmagomedov, a guy who a lot of people also call one of the top 10 greatest of all time. However, Khabib, it was only till like his last 5 fights in the UFC that he actually started facing good talent. Khabib's not got an impressive opponent win-loss percentage record. A lot of his opponents have ended up kind of looking, well, a lot of his opponents for like his first 15 to to 20 fights in the UFC, well, in MMA, kind of just work cans, yet he's still kind of rendered as one of the greatest of all time. So I don't think it's necessarily a good indicator of how good a fighter is. And the final indicator I've got on this list is, does Joe Rogan hype them up? Do they get the Joe Rogan privilege? Why this is useful? You must be impressive one way or another. Listen, if Joe Rogan has managed to talk about you on his podcast or hyped you up for whatever reason, there must be something, whether it be jiu-jitsu or a certain kickboxing style, there must be something impressive that Joe Rogan has caught his attention to on you for. There must be something that you've displayed to Joe Rogan to get him impressed with you in the first place. The next reason is you can bring more hype to their name. If Joe Rogan's talking about you, a lot of MMA fans are also going to be intrigued about why Joe Rogan's so fond of you. Therefore, it's going to generate some more hype to your name. Again, that has absolutely zero indication of you being good, because hype is hype, but it can help bring the hype to your name. And the third reason is you must display some great calf kicks or look big for the division. Joe Rogan seems to be obsessed with fighters that are good, have good calf kicks, or are just big for the division. So the chances are, if your opponent's getting hyped up by Joe Rogan, there's a high chance that they display good calf kicks, or they're, you know, big for the division. So those are some reasons why it's useful. Some reasons why it's completely useless, though, is that Joe Rogan glaze doesn't really mean much. He's glazed so many fighters throughout his time, and a lot of them haven't really been able to go and accomplish great things in the UFC, so I don't think it's really a good factor. It doesn't really mean much, does Rogan glazing. Many fighters have had the Rogan privilege whilst performing terribly. Ryan Hall against Ilia Topuria is a good example. Israel Adesanya got completely squashed and demolished by Jan Blachowicz, but in Joe Rogan's mind, Adesanya was the greatest fighter in the world for those 25 minutes, so Joe Rogan has had, you know, Joe Rogan has given privilege to certain fighters whilst they've performed completely terribly. And it has zero indication of how much potential a fighter really has. There could be a fighter that Joe Rogan has glazed to the maximum. Doesn't mean they're a good fighter. There could have been a fighter that Joe Rogan has completely avoided. Doesn't mean they're a good fighter. So Joe Rogan, it's just, again, similar to the hype situation. Joe Rogan might be fond of you. Joe Rogan can't get you these world titles. Joe Rogan's hype can't make you a big problem in the UFC. If we look at some fighters who Joe Rogan have hyped up and they've gone on to do great things, Alex Pereira. Joe Rogan was very fond of Alex Pereira before he even joined the UFC, and now he's one of the greatest of all time. Khalil Roundtree, Joe Rogan's always been a massive fan of his striking, and he's going to be fighting for a belt in his next fight. Joe Pyfer, Rogan was a massive, well, not a massive fan, but Joe Rogan was talking about Joe Pyfer before Joe Pyfer was really getting started in the UFC, so those are some examples of fighters who Joe Rogan has hyped up before they've managed to do great things, but there's also been fighters who Joe Rogan has hyped up that haven't looked so impressive. Ryan Hall. There was something about Ryan Hall that Joe Rogan was completely obsessed with. Something about his jiu-jitsu that Joe Rogan was obsessed with. And Ryan Hall ended up getting demolished by Ilia Topuria and never really made it far in the UFC. Israel Adesanya. Joe Rogan was talking about how good he looked in that fight with Dricus du Plessis and Jan Blachowicz, only for him to go and lose those fights. Ian Gary hasn't looked super impressive in his last couple of fights, but Joe Rogan seems to be his biggest fan. So I think it's not really a massive indicator. Maybe it's similar to the prospect situation where it can show that they're impressive somewhat, but I don't think it can be a real good indication of how good a fighter is. So those are some indicators of a fighter being good, and how impressive these indicators are. How important and how valuable are these indicators of a fighter being good if you're not going to watch their fight? So those are some examples of indicators. Let me know if I'd have missed any out. Thank you for watching.